I can still hear the church bells from that night, low and trembling, as if even they were too frightened to ring properly. People think the worst part of my story is that my own father sold me to a man the whole town whispered about, a man they called a monster. But they don't know the half of it. The real terror came later, on my wedding night, when I uncovered the truth he'd been hiding, a truth so dark it still makes my hands shake after all these years. My dear, my name is Lillian, but you can just call me Lily. I'm an old woman now with more winters behind me than ahead, and yet this story, well, it's the one I've kept tucked away deepest in my heart. I've never said it out loud, not once, not fully, not until today. And I suppose I'm finally ready. Ready to breathe it out. Ready to let the truth settle in the open air where it always should have been. Before we begin, sweetheart, make yourself comfortable. If you're anything like me, you'll want a warm cup of tea or a soft blanket across your lap. And if you find yourself moved by what I share, if something touches you or reminds you of a moment in your own life, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe. It helps this old grandma more than you'd ever guess, especially as I learn my way around all this new technology. I promise I read every message with care. Now, come with me back to a time when girls weren't always given choices, when towns were small, when secrets lived in the cracks of wooden porches and behind lace curtains. Back to the days when I still believed that life would unfold gently, before I learned how quickly it can turn sharp. And remember, child, everything you're about to hear is true. I grew up in a small town tucked between rolling fields and a river that curved like a silver ribbon through the valley, a place where children ran barefoot in the summers and women hung laundry on long wooden poles that swayed in the breeze. It was the late 1950s, back when neighbors called out to you from their porches, back when every family had at least one secret but pretended they didn't, and back when a girl like me, barely 17, could still dream in rose-colored shades without knowing how quickly those colors could bleed. Our home sat at the end of a dusty street lined with oak trees so old their roots pushed up the sidewalks. The house wasn't much to look at, weather-beaten siding, a porch that leaned a little to the left, and shutters that Mama repainted every spring even though the color faded by summer. But inside it smelled like warm bread, lavender soap, and the faint sweetness of Mama's lilac perfume, which she dabbed behind her ears every morning even if she wasn't going anywhere at all. She believed a woman should greet the day feeling like her best self, even if the world outside didn't notice. Mama was the softest part of my childhood, her laughter light and tinkling like wind chimes, her hands always busy sewing, baking, or brushing the hair out of my face as if she needed to reassure herself I was still there. Papa, on the other hand, felt heavier somehow, like a man made of stone that had learned how to walk. He worked at the lumber mill down by the river, a place that smelled of pine and sweat and sharp metal. He'd come home every evening with sawdust clinging to his shirt, his boots leaving rough tracks across the kitchen floor. Sometimes he'd smile, those were the better days, but more often he would sit at the table, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as though the weight of our lives sat squarely on his back. Poverty does strange things to a man. It doesn't always make them angry, not outwardly anyway. Sometimes it just makes them smaller, quieter, like their spirit folds inward to keep from cracking. We weren't the poorest family in town, but the pantry shelves were often more empty than full. Mama stretched meals like magic, turning scraps into stews and day-old bread into something warm and comforting. She'd hum while she cooked, as though she could stir hope back into the pot. I helped her when I could, peeling potatoes, washing dishes, folding laundry in the backyard while my little brothers chased each other between the sheets snapping on the line. I was the oldest child and that meant more chores, more responsibility, but back then I didn't mind. I liked being useful. I liked feeling like I was helping keep our world stitched together. School was a quiet refuge for me. I loved old books, the way their pages smelled like dust and stories, the way the sunlight made the words glow during afternoon reading hour. Sometimes I stayed behind to tidy the shelves just so I could linger in that warm, paper-scented air a little longer. My teacher said I had hands made for nursing or teaching. I didn't know exactly what I wanted yet, but I knew it involved helping people. I wanted a life that felt gentle. I wanted love, not the dramatic kind from the movies, but the soft, everyday kind, the kind Mama always said was worth more than diamonds. But even in those simpler times, shadows creeped around the edges of my world. I didn't notice them at first, not until the day I saw the worried way Mama watched Papa as he counted the last of the grocery money. Or the nights he came home later and later, rubbing his temples with both hands, muttering things he wouldn't say in front of us children. There were whispers in town about layoffs at the mill. About cost cuts. About men being replaced with newer machines that didn't need rest or food or wages. Papa never mentioned it, but Mama started saving scraps of fabric, patching clothes twice instead of once, cutting back on sugar, then flour, then meat. Our meals grew thinner, my brothers asking for seconds when there weren't any to give. So we had each other. In the evenings, we'd gather on the porch to watch the sun sink behind the trees. Fireflies would blink across the yard, and Mama would tell stories from her girlhood, stories of dances and long skirts, and the time she met Papa at the county fair. I remember watching her face as she spoke, the way her eyes softened when she talked about love before life made everything so hard. I think she wanted that for me, a gentler world, a future where I wouldn't have to choose between love and survival. But life has a way of bending its own direction no matter how tightly you hold on to dreams. I still remember the afternoon when everything shifted. It was late autumn, the air crisp and sharp enough to sting my cheeks. I was hanging laundry in the yard when I heard the front gate creak open. I turned, expecting a neighbor or one of the local children, but instead there stood a tall figure whose shadow stretched across the grass toward me, long and heavy like a storm cloud. It was Mr. Harrow. I'd seen him only in passing before, once at the general store, once at church, though he never stayed long. There was something unsettling about him, something in the way he carried himself. Broad shoulders, dark eyes, and a stillness that made people uneasy. Folks in town whispered that he lived alone on a large stretch of land outside the city limits. They said he was dangerous, that he had a temper, that he'd buried things out there no one dared ask about. Children told stories about his past, wild tales, the kind kids pass around like candy. But grown folks didn't laugh when they spoke his name. They lowered their voices, glanced over their shoulders, and changed the subject. So when he stepped into our yard that day, I felt the breath catch in my throat. Mama appeared behind me, her hands still damp from washing dishes. She froze when she saw him. Papa came out moments later, wiping his hands on his work pants, his eyes narrowing with a mix of suspicion and resignation. There was a quiet exchange of greetings, stiff and strange, as though no one quite knew how to stand or breathe around this man. I didn't understand why he had come. I didn't know he brought with him the first thread of a decision that would unravel my entire life. At least, not yet. From the moment Mr. Harrow stepped into our yard, a heaviness settled over our home, as if the walls themselves sensed something was changing. I remember the way Mama's hands fidgeted at her apron strings and how Papa couldn't seem to stand still, shifting his weight from one foot to the other like a man preparing for a confession. They invited him inside, though I could see neither of them truly wanted to, and I followed quietly, my heart thumping with a nervousness I couldn't explain. The air inside felt tight, too warm, too quiet. Mama offered him tea, her hands trembling just enough for me to notice, but he shook his head politely and sat rigidly in Papa's armchair, as though he didn't quite belong in a place arranged for gentleness. I perched at the far edge of the sofa, trying to appear invisible. The conversation started with small talk, but it didn't stay there long. Their voices dropped to low murmurs, and though I strained to hear, I couldn't make out the words. Only the tone, tense, urgent, clipped. Occasionally, Mr. Harrow glanced in my direction, never for long, but long enough to make my skin prickle. It wasn't a cruel look, nor was it warm. It was assessing. As if he were memorizing something important about me. As if he were weighing a decision he'd already made. When the conversation concluded, Papa walked him to the door with a stiffness I recognized only from the days collectors came around. And Mama, who usually chattered nervously to dissolve tension, stood silent, gripping a dish towel between her fingers until I feared it would tear. They didn't tell me what the visit was about. Not that day. Not the next. Not for weeks. But the house grew increasingly tense, the silence between Mama and Papa stretching into long, uneasy evenings where neither seemed able to look the other in the eye. I'd find Mama sitting by the kitchen table late at night, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold. Papa came home quieter than ever, shoulders slumped, eyes tired. I asked once, just once, what was wrong, and Mama pressed a finger to her lips, whispering, "Not now, Lily. Please." That please told me everything. Whatever burden they carried, it was heavier than anything I could imagine. Then came the night I heard them whispering behind their bedroom door. I wasn't trying to listen. Quiet homes have thin walls, and parents often forget how easily their voices travel. I had just blown out my lamp and crawled under the quilt when Papa's voice drifted through, low and ragged. "I don't have another choice," he said. "We're running out of time." Mama's response was muffled, but her trembling sobs were unmistakable. "But she's our daughter," she cried. "There must be another way." Papa didn't answer for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "If there was, Mary, don't you think I'd take it? We can't pay the debts. We can't keep the boys fed. And winter's coming. We've already lost too much." I squeezed my pillow, my heart pounding so loudly I wondered if they could hear it. I didn't know what debts he meant. I didn't know winter could threaten a family like a wolf at the door. But Mama's soft weeping told me the situation was far worse than they'd ever let on. The next morning, everyone at the table acted as if nothing had happened. But the silence tasted different, like it had secrets curled inside it. It wasn't until Papa headed off to work, shrugging on his coat in a hurry, that I saw the brown envelope, thick, heavy-looking, peeking from the inside pocket. He didn't know I noticed. The envelope slipped into view only for a moment as he buttoned his jacket, but that glimpse was enough. I'd never seen so much paper money before. Even just the edge of it told me that whatever was happening was far beyond the ordinary. When the door shut behind him, Mama sank into a chair as though her strength had gone with him. Day after day that envelope haunted me. It wasn't always in his pocket. Sometimes I saw Mama tuck it into a drawer. Sometimes Papa would set it on the table as though contemplating it. They never spoke of it near me, but their eyes followed it with a kind of fearful reverence, as if it were both salvation and damnation in one. For weeks, tension grew like vines around our home. Then one Sunday morning, Papa asked me to wear my Sunday dress, my white one with the blue sash. My heart fluttered with unease. We weren't going to church, not that I could tell. Mama dressed too but looked pale as a sheet, her hands shaking each time she tied or buttoned something. I stood in the doorway of my bedroom watching her fumble with the last button of my sleeve, and she suddenly stopped, cupped my face and whispered, "Whatever happens today, remember I love you. Always." Her eyes shimmered with tears she tried to hide. Before I could ask anything, Papa called from the parlor, "It's time, Lily." I stepped inside, smoothing my dress, and froze. Mr. Harrow was standing there. His dark suit looked too formal for our humble house, and his expression was unreadable, though his eyes softened just barely when he saw me. Papa cleared his throat, a deep, painful sound. Mama gripped my hand so tightly I could feel her nails dig into my skin. Papa didn't meet my eyes when he said it. "Lillian, Mr. Harrow has made an arrangement. You're to be his wife." The room spun. My breath snagged in my throat. Mama let out a quiet, strangled sound. My fingers went cold. I could only whisper, "But I'm 17. Papa winced. Mama covered her mouth. And Mr. Harrow, he didn't flinch. Not once. He simply stepped forward, voice low and steady, and said, "I will take care of her." He said it like a vow and a warning tangled together. In that moment, the brown envelope's meaning crystallized. The weight of it. The whispered arguments. The late-night tears. Papa hadn't been saving money. He had been paid. Paid for me. After the arrangement was spoken aloud, after Papa's trembling voice declared that I was to become the wife of the man standing rigidly in our parlor, life in our home shifted in a way I felt more than understood. I moved through the days like someone walking underwater, numb and muted, each sound distant and distorted. Mama hovered around me with a kind of frantic tenderness, brushing my hair more often than usual, adjusting my clothes even when they didn't need adjusting, cooking my favorite meals though none of us seemed to have the appetite to enjoy them. Papa grew quieter than ever, and every time I caught his eyes, he looked away as though ashamed to face what he'd done. But the strangest part of it all was how frequently, how unnaturally often, Mr. Harrow began appearing at our doorstep. Not during decent hours either. His visits came after dark, when the sky was almost ink black and the only sounds outside were crickets and the occasional truck passing distantly along the highway. Each time he would knock softly, the kind of knock that didn't wake the children but sent a chill along my spine. Papa always opened the door quickly as if he'd been waiting, and ushered him inside before any neighbors could see. I'd sit in my room pretending to read while my ears strained for clues. Their voices stayed low, sometimes drifting into urgency, other times clipped and tense. And though I could never make out the words, I learned the rhythm of their fear. Some nights it lasted a few minutes. Others stretched late into the night. One evening, curiosity tugged at me harder than fear. The clock had struck 11, Mama had gone to bed exhausted from worry, and Papa and Mr. Harrow were once again murmuring on the porch in the dark. I crept from my room, my bare feet careful on the wooden floorboards, and pressed myself beside the curtain that covered the small front window. I lifted a tiny corner just enough to peer out without being seen. The porch light was off, but the moon was bright enough that I could make out their silhouettes. Papa stood with his hands on his hips, shoulders hunched, his posture the same as when he faced a problem too big to solve. Mr. Harrow towered beside him, struck in that same rigid stillness he always carried, like a man accustomed to vigilance. The wind carried just enough of their conversation for me to hear fragments. Papa's voice was tired. "It has to be soon. The longer we wait," he trailed off, running a hand over his face. Mr. Harrow's response was firmer, quieter but intense. "Not yet. She isn't ready. Not yet." Those two words made my heart thud painfully against my ribs. If I had been older, wiser, I might have understood then that he wasn't talking about marriage preparations or some tradition. But at 17, the only interpretation my frightened mind could cling to was that I wasn't yet ready for him as a husband, for his touch, for whatever expectations people had of a wedding night. That thought alone made my stomach twist. Suddenly, as though sensing eyes on him, Mr. Harrow turned his head toward my window. The moon cast just enough light across his face for me to see a tension there, a haunted wariness, as if he feared not being the watcher but being watched. In a split second I dropped the curtain and held my breath, pressing myself flat against the wall. I didn't dare move. I expected Papa to barge inside and scold me for spying, but a long moment passed with no footsteps, only the low murmur of voices resuming conversation. When I finally crawled back to my room, my knees were shaking so badly I nearly collapsed onto my bed. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I feared him, but because something inside me whispered that there was a reason behind all this that I didn't yet understand. A reason no one would share. From then on, the nighttime visits became even stranger. Sometimes Mama would sit on the bottom stair, clutching her rosary, praying under her breath while Papa paced the parlor waiting for that soft knock on the door. Other nights, all the lamps would be turned off as if we were hiding. Once I caught Papa staring out the front window long before dusk, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the windowsill so hard his knuckles turned white. When I asked if everything was all right, he snapped, "Go to your room," in a voice so sharp I flinched. Then he immediately apologized, his eyes wet, and kissed my forehead like he feared he'd never get the chance again. But what puzzled me most wasn't Papa's anxiety, it was the way Mr. Harrow looked at him. Every time he stepped into our house, their eyes met with a familiarity that didn't make sense. It wasn't the look of two men making a simple arrangement. It was the look of men sharing a dangerous secret. And though they tried to hide it, fear lived between them. Real fear. Not of each other but of something closing in. It was on one of these tense nights as I sat on my bed listening to the quiet murmur of their voices below, that something inside me shifted. For the first time since the arrangement was announced, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, the monster I feared wasn't the tall man with the cold eyes. Maybe the monster was something else entirely. And perhaps I was being given to him not as a sacrifice but as a shield. A few days before the wedding, before my name would be signed onto a life I didn't choose, Mama asked me to take a basket of pies to Mr. Harrow's property as a gesture of goodwill. Though her voice trembled so much I knew it wasn't goodwill she hoped for. It was mercy. The path to his home wound through tall, whispering grass, the kind that brushed against my legs as though trying to warn me to turn back. His house came into view slowly, rising alone on its wide stretch of land like a forgotten sentinel. It was far larger than I expected, 3 stories tall, dark wood, shutters closed tight, as though the house itself didn't want the outside world peering in. No flowers. No garden. No chickens or porch swing or the little touches of warmth that made a place feel lived in. Just emptiness. And silence. A loneliness so deep it made the hairs on my arms lift. I hesitated before climbing the front steps, my heart hammering against my ribs. But as I knocked and waited with that pie basket trembling in my hands, nobody came. Minutes passed. The wind creaked the boards beneath me, and I began to wonder if I should simply leave the basket and go. But then I heard something, a thud, faint but distinct, coming from the back of the property. Curiosity tugged at me even stronger than fear. I walked around the side of the house, my steps cautious, my senses taut as a rabbit's. Behind the house, half hidden beneath the shade of an ancient cedar tree, sat a weathered wooden shed I hadn't noticed from the road. Its door hung slightly open, swaying gently in the wind with an eerie rhythmic squeak. Something about that sound made my breath hitch. Pushing the door with my fingertips, I peered inside, expecting tools or firewood. Instead, the dim light revealed a space cluttered with dust, old crates, and in the far corner, a large trunk. It was massive, the kind of trunk sailors used generations ago, but what made my stomach twist were the chains wrapped around it, thick, rusted chains held shut by a heavy iron lock the size of my fist. A cold shiver crawled up my spine. Why would a man chain shut a trunk like that? What was inside that needed restraining? The trunk itself seemed to hum with unease, like it held memories, secrets, or something worse. I stepped closer without meaning to, drawn in with slow, hesitant steps. That was when a shadow fell across the door. My breath caught. I turned and there he was. Mr. Harrow stood framed in the doorway, his dark figure blotting out the light, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharper than I had ever seen them. "You shouldn't be in here," he said, voice low, not angry, more like frightened. As if I had stumbled into danger. As if the danger was not him, but something else entirely. "I'm sorry," I stammered, clutching the pie basket like a shield. No one answered the door and I heard, my excuse died in my throat as he stepped inside. For a large man, he moved with a quietness that felt unnatural. His gaze flicked toward the trunk, then snapped back to me, his jaw tightening. "This shed is off limits," he repeated, firmer this time. Not a threat, but a warning laced with urgency. He took the basket from my trembling hands as gently as one might lift a sleeping child, then ushered me out, closing the shed door behind us with a finality that made my skin prickle. I walked back toward the field path, but halfway across the yard I couldn't help glancing over my shoulder. He stood by the shed, hand resting on the door, staring at it with a look of quiet torment, as if whatever lay inside that chained trunk wasn't simply a possession, but a burden he carried alone. For the rest of that day the image haunted me, the locked trunk, the chains, his face pale with something that looked dangerously close to fear. I had no words for what I felt then, no understanding of the truth that hovered just beyond my reach. But one thought rose above all the others, clear as the church bell tolling on a winter morning. There was far more to this man than the whispers people exchanged behind closed doors. And far more to the life I was being pulled into than anyone was willing to tell me. The morning of my wedding arrived wrapped in a fog so thick it felt like the world was holding its breath, refusing to fully exist. Mama woke me before sunrise, brushing my hair with trembling fingers while trying to hide the redness around her eyes. I didn't ask if she'd slept. I already knew the answer. The sky outside our window was washed in pale gray, the kind that makes even familiar streets look unfamiliar, and as I looked at my own reflection, I barely recognized the girl staring back. I was 17, too young to wed, too young to understand sacrifice, yet somehow old enough to carry the weight of two families' survival. My dress was simple, homemade, nothing like the gowns wealthier brides wore. But Mama had stitched every thread with care, and when she tied the final ribbon, her hands lingered just a moment too long. "Lily," she whispered, voice cracking, "you come back to visit me, you hear? No matter what." Her words sank deep, not quite a goodbye but close enough to make my chest ache sharply. Papa didn't come into the room. He stayed outside, pacing, smoking, avoiding my eyes. I felt anger flare inside me, raw and tight and hot, but there was no room for it, not today, not when everything was already so fragile. The ceremony was held in the small church at the center of town. The building was old, paint peeling, but flowers had been placed at the entrance by neighbors who pitied me quietly from behind their forced smiles. Everyone came, everyone except the people who had whispered about Mr. Harrow for years. Those folks stayed home, too afraid to even watch from afar. And still I felt their judgment like cold fingers on the back of my neck. When the church doors opened and I stepped inside, the murmurs began. I could feel every stare, every breath, every speculation. Poor girl. Poor child. She won't last long. But what struck me hardest was the man waiting at the altar. Mr. Harrow stood tall, dressed in a black suit that fit him almost too well. He looked solemn, almost regal, but his eyes, those dark, haunted eyes, were softer than I had ever seen them. Not hungry, not predatory, not monstrous. Just tired. Deeply, painfully tired. And when our eyes met, something inside me shifted unexpectedly. Not affection. Not comfort. But a question, one that would follow me long after that day. If he is truly the monster they all say, why does he look like the one who fears me? The ceremony passed like a dream I wasn't fully awake in. The priest spoke, our hands were joined, vows were exchanged, his voice steady, mine trembling, and before I could catch my breath, it was done. The church bell rang. I was a wife. His wife. The man who owned my future now stood beside me, close enough for me to feel the steady rise and fall of his breath. Outside the church, we were met with a smattering of applause, though most people only clapped because they felt they should. Mr. Harrow escorted me to his carriage, the horse snorting in the cold air. My family watched from the steps, Mama clutching the edge of her shawl, Papa with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, and as the carriage pulled away, Mama's figure blurred into the gray morning until she vanished entirely. That was when the realization hit me, sharp and sudden. I was leaving everything I had ever known, and stepping into a life I didn't understand. The ride to his estate was quiet. He sat across from me, not beside me, as though afraid to invade my space. He said only one sentence during that entire ride, one that hung in the air like an omen. I will never harm you, Lillian. Remember that. His voice held a softness I wasn't prepared for, but also a sorrow that made my heart stutter. Why would he say that? Why did he feel the need to? What did he think I believed about him? When we arrived at the house, the same large shadowed structure I had visited days earlier, my stomach twisted. It felt even more imposing now that it was mine. Now that I would sleep under its roof. He helped me down from the carriage, his hand warm despite the chill, and guided me inside. The front door groaned open, revealing the dim hallway with its heavy drapes and antique portraits whose eyes seemed to follow my every step. Everything felt still, too still, like the house itself was waiting. Then as he led me toward the staircase, I heard it, faint, distant, coming from deep within the house. A soft, muffled cry. Not animal. Not wind. Human. And that was the moment my heart truly began to fear the man I had just married. The moment that soft, muffled cry floated through the hallway, every hair on my arms lifted as if the house itself had breathed against my skin. I froze on the staircase, my hand gripping the polished wooden rail so tightly my knuckles turned white. Mr. Harrow stopped one step above me, his shoulders tensing in a way that told me he had heard it too, though he pretended otherwise. It's an old house, he said quietly, not turning to face me. Wood shifts. Pipes settle. But his explanation was too quick, too practiced, and far too calm for a man who didn't expect that sound. I wasn't foolish. I had grown up reading people out of necessity, and his voice held the faintest tremor beneath the surface. He continued up the stairs without waiting for a response, and I followed, though every instinct screamed at me to run back down and out the door. The second-floor hallway was dimly lit, lined with thick rugs and heavier silence. At the far end, past the bedrooms, sat a locked door, dark wood, reinforced metal hinges, and a gleam of new steel where a bolt had recently been replaced. I didn't know why, but my eyes were pulled to it like a magnet. I could feel something behind it. Not physically, spiritually, emotionally. Something that wasn't supposed to be heard. He showed me to our room, a large chamber with a fireplace, tall windows, and a bed far too grand for a girl who had grown up sharing one with her sister. He stood just inside the doorway, keeping distance between us, his posture stiff and formal. You will have your privacy, he said almost apologetically. I won't come in unless you invite me. His hands stayed clasped behind his back, as though he feared what they might do if left to their own devices. It was such an odd thing, a man with a monstrous reputation offering restraint rather than demand. I managed a nod, unsure what else to do. When he finally turned to leave, I expected him to close the door. Instead he paused, one hand resting on the frame. If you hear anything at night, he said without looking at me, don't wander. This house is old. Easy to get lost in. Then he added in a softer voice almost swallowed by the shadows, and some rooms aren't safe. Before I could question him, he stepped into the hallway and shut the door, not harshly, not dramatically, but gently, as if afraid the sound might disturb something sleeping. I stood alone in the center of the room, my heartbeat thudding loudly against the quiet. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, turning the glass milky and opaque. I lit a candle from the mantel, its glow flickering weakly in the drafty air, and moved to unpack what little I had brought: 2 dresses, a comb, and Mama's rosary. My hands shook as I placed the rosary on the vanity. That was when I heard it again, a soft cry, almost a whimper. But this time it wasn't from downstairs. Came through the wall. The wall right behind my bed. I stepped toward it, my breath catching as I pressed my ear gently against the cold plaster. The crying was faint, strained, as though whoever it belonged to had long grown tired of calling out. And beneath it, oh God, there was something else. A rhythm. A scratching. Like small nails dragging lightly against wood. I stumbled back, knocking into the nightstand. My candle wavered dangerously before steadying again, casting trembling shadows on the walls. My mind raced with every story I had heard, rumors of Mr. Harrow's late wife, whispers of madness, of strange happenings on this estate. But none had mentioned crying. None had mentioned locked rooms. None had mentioned someone or something trapped. The hours crawled by as I sat on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, afraid to close my eyes. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to open on its own, half expecting him to return with some explanation. But the house remained still except for the occasional pop of the wooden beams and the lingering, intermittent muffled sounds from the other side of the wall. When exhaustion finally weighed too heavily, I lay down but didn't dare fully sleep. Instead, I drifted in and out, each small sound jolting me awake. It was sometime near dawn when I heard footsteps in the hallway, soft, slow, cautious. They stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, waiting. Then a whisper, barely audible but unmistakably human, slipped under the crack of the door. "Don't open the door at night." My blood ran cold. Because the voice wasn't his. It was a woman's. The whisper seeped through the crack beneath the door like a breath of cold air, soft yet sharp enough to slice straight into my bones. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just sat there on the bed, frozen, wondering if I had slipped into some hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But no, my instincts knew better. That was a woman's voice. A real voice. Pause. Urgent. Fearful. I swallowed hard, my fingers twisting the blanket in tight knots as the footsteps retreated down the hallway slowly, as though the person was trying not to be heard. I waited several long, aching minutes before gathering enough courage to approach the door. The hallway beyond was quiet, too quiet, and though the house had felt eerie since the moment I entered it, now it felt almost predatory, as if it were listening for me. The fog outside the windows had thickened overnight, pressing against the glass like ghostly hands, dimming the light and casting blurred shadows across the floor. The air felt colder than before, as though the whole house had exhaled something icy into its corridors. I cracked the door open just an inch, peering out cautiously. Nothing. No woman. No figure slipping around the corner. No footprints on the carpet runner. It was as though no one had been there at all. But the whisper still rang in my memory. Don't open the door at night. It wasn't the kind of warning a stranger offers lightly. I stepped back inside and latched the door again, this time sliding one of the small wooden chairs beneath the handle. Maybe it was foolish, maybe childish, but fear makes even grown women cling to silly protections. As I paced the room, trying to quiet the storm inside my chest, my eyes drifted again to the wall near the bed, the one I'd heard crying through. I pressed my hand against it gently, half expecting to feel someone pressing back. But the wall was cold, unmoving, perfectly still. The morning crept on slowly, and with each passing minute, a strange mixture of dread and determination began to settle in my stomach. Whoever whispered to me wasn't trying to scare me, they were trying to save me. But from what? Or from whom? When soft footsteps finally approached the room again, I flinched violently, expecting the mysterious woman to return. Instead, a familiar knock sounded. 3 gentle taps. Mr. Harrow. I hesitated before answering, unsure whether I should tell him about the voice or keep it to myself. Should a monster know someone was warning me? Or was he the one who needed warning? I opened the door only partway. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm but his eyes red, as though he hadn't slept either. He paused, looking over my shoulder. "Did something happen? You look shaken." I swallowed hard. "The house makes strange noises." His jaw tensed just slightly. "It's old," he replied softly. "But I told you you'll be safe here." It wasn't reassurance. It was fear disguised as reassurance. He invited me downstairs for breakfast, and though the idea of wandering the halls terrified me, the idea of being alone scared me even more. The dining room was larger than I remembered, its wallpaper faded but elegant, its windows letting in pale light that made the room feel cold rather than welcoming. He had laid out a surprisingly thoughtful meal: eggs, bread, even marmalade from town. He barely touched his own plate, instead watching me with that strange, heavy sadness that made him seem older than he was. I waited until halfway through the meal before gathering the courage to ask, "Does anyone else live here?" His fork froze midair only for a fraction of a second, but enough to confirm what I already suspected. "No," he said too quickly. "No one." The lie clanged between us like a dropped pan. I set down my fork. "I heard something last night." His eyes snapped up to mine, sharp, startled, almost frightened. "What did you hear?" "Crying. And footsteps. And a woman's voice." His face drained of color. Truly drained, like a man who'd just heard a prophecy come true. He stood abruptly, almost knocking his chair back. "You must have been dreaming," he insisted. "You were exhausted. Overwhelmed. It was your first night here." But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. He knew something. Knew exactly what I'd heard. Before I could press further, something crashed loudly upstairs. Something heavy, something unmistakably real. We both froze. The sound echoed through the house, vibrating in the floorboards beneath our feet. Mr. Harrow closed his eyes for one brief second, gathering himself, then whispered something so quietly I almost didn't hear it. "She wasn't supposed to wake." My blood turned to ice. "Who?" I whispered. His eyes opened slowly. "Haunted. Broken. My wife." For a long, breathless moment, I simply stared at him, the word wife echoing in my ears like a distant church bell. His wife. The wife the town said had died years ago. The wife whose absence had turned him into a rumor and then into a monster. The wife he had told me nothing about except now, in this moment, when fear had stripped away his careful silence. Before I could form a single question, he rushed toward the staircase, grabbing a ring of keys from the mantel with hands that trembled more than a man of his stature should ever allow. I followed him on instinct alone, my heartbeat pounding in my throat as we climbed the stairs two at a time. Another crash sounded from the upper hallway, with splintering metal scraping, and though I had never been a brave girl, I felt myself pulled forward by a force I couldn't explain. At the top of the stairs, he hesitated, turning to me with a look that was not anger but pleading. "Stay here, Lillian," he whispered. "Please." But I didn't stay. Perhaps I should have. Perhaps it would have spared me a lifetime of memory I still cannot fully escape. But something inside me, a mixture of dread and a strange, aching sympathy, drove me behind him as he moved toward the locked door at the end of the hall. The door rattled violently as we approached, the sound of frantic movement coming from inside. He fumbled with the keys, swearing under his breath each time one failed to fit the lock. Finally, with a loud click, the bolt released and he pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. I caught only a glimpse at first, darkness, a figure darting back, the outline of long disheveled hair, but that glimpse was enough to root me to the spot, every nerve in my body trying to understand what my eyes had barely captured. I pressed closer, peering through the narrow gap. The room was small, windowless, and lined with padded walls. Not a bedroom. Not a sitting room. Something else. Something meant to contain a person who could not be trusted with freedom. And there she was. His wife. A gaunt woman with hollow cheeks and wide, terrified eyes that darted wildly between me and her husband. She clung to the shadows, her dress torn, her feet bare, her hair hanging in ragged strands around her face. She looked like someone who had once lived a normal life and then fallen into some bottomless darkness no one had tried to pull her out of. "Clara," he whispered as he stepped inside, his voice breaking on her name. "Please, please, you have to stay calm." But she screamed, a raw, guttural sound that tore through the room and ricocheted down the hallway. She lunged at him, nails slashing through the air, and he caught her wrists with practiced sorrow, not anger. "I'm here," he said softly. "I'm right here." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I had heard of women who'd lost their minds after childbirth, after losing children, after illnesses no doctor in town could name. But I had never imagined one locked away like a secret. A secret the town had twisted into something unrecognizable. As he held her there, whispering soft, broken comforts meant more for himself than for her, Clara's wild eyes shifted. They drifted past his shoulder and locked onto me. For one horrible second she went completely still. Not blinking. Not breathing. Just staring straight through me as though she had suddenly recognized something familiar, or threatening, or both. Her lips trembled. And in a hoarse whisper that sounded scraped raw from the inside of her throat, She spoke the first words I had ever heard her say. She looks like her. My stomach twisted violently. Her? Who is her? The question echoed in my mind as panic clawed up my spine. I stumbled back a step, my heel catching on the edge of the rug, but Mr. Harrow was too focused on soothing Clara to notice the fear flooding my face. He carried her gently toward the cot in the corner, humming under his breath. The tune was uneven, trembling, but tender, the kind of melody someone hums when they are desperately hoping to calm a frightened child. He laid her down carefully, brushing her hair back from her damp forehead, whispering words I couldn't quite hear. Slowly, mercifully, her eyes fluttered closed. When he finally stepped out of the room and pulled the heavy door shut behind him, the sound echoed through the hallway like the slam of a coffin lid. He leaned forward until his forehead pressed against the wood, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the house itself had settled onto his back. His breath shook. "Lillian," he said softly without turning around, "there are things I never meant for you to know." In that moment, a terrible clarity settled over me. The townspeople were wrong. Mr. Harrow wasn't a monster. But something in that house was. And I wasn't sure which of the three of us, him, Clara, or me, would break first. For several long minutes, neither of us spoke. The house fell into an unnatural silence, the kind that presses against your ears until you become painfully aware of your own breathing. Even the walls seemed to be listening. Mr. Harrow remained there, forehead against the door, drawing in slow, uneven breaths as if bracing himself for a confession he could no longer hold back. When he finally straightened, he didn't turn toward me. Instead, he walked down the hallway a few steps, dragging a trembling hand through his hair. I followed at a distance, my fingers hovering just above the wallpaper for balance, because everything inside me felt tilted, unsteady, as though the world had shifted without warning. He stopped at the window overlooking the fog-choked lawn. Outside, the mist clung to the ground like a shroud, swallowing the hedges and blurring the line between earth and sky. He stared out at it for a long time before speaking again. When he did, his voice sounded hollow, scraped raw by years of silence. "Clara wasn't always like that," he murmured. "She was the brightest woman I ever knew." I held my breath. "She noticed things other people missed," he continued, his voice softening with memory. "The way sunlight would catch on dew in the early mornings. The way the roses leaned toward the fence after a storm. She laughed easily, deeply. She made the world feel lighter just by being in it." His words slowed, each one heavy with loss. "She loved the gardens, especially in spring." Then his voice cracked. "But after our daughter died, something in her shattered." My heart lurched. A daughter. Their daughter. The meaning of Clara's words slammed into me with sickening force. "She looks like her." The air felt suddenly thin, difficult to breathe. I swallowed hard, my pulse roaring in my ears. "I didn't want to lock her away," he said quickly, as though trying to justify himself to a judge only he could see. "I begged the doctor for help. I begged anyone who would listen. But all they told me was that people fall into darkness sometimes. That she needed to be kept safe. Her safety. And mine." He turned toward me then, and I flinched at the pain in his eyes. "She hurt herself. Then she tried to hurt me. But it wasn't her. Not really. It was the illness twisting her mind into something unrecognizable." His hands clenched at his sides. "So I closed that room. I kept her hidden. The town began to whisper. They said I'd killed her. They said I was a murderer. A monster." He laughed softly, bitterly. "And I let them believe it. Because the truth was worse." A chill crept down my spine as I realized what he meant. To the townspeople, a dead woman was easier to accept than a living one locked away. Easier than admitting how fragile the mind could be. Easier than facing the fear that what happened to Claire could happen to anyone. "And the child?" I asked quietly, my voice barely more than a breath. He closed his eyes. "She died in an accident. A fall near the river. Claire was never the same after that. She began seeing her everywhere. In reflections. In strangers. Sometimes," his voice faltered. "Sometimes she thought she had come back." My knees weakened. Suddenly, I understood why Clara's gaze had felt like a blade. Why her words had struck so deep. To her fractured mind, I wasn't just a stranger standing in her doorway. I was a ghost. A memory. A reminder of everything she had lost. The house creaked softly around us, settling as though it, too, carried the weight of the truth. Somewhere behind the locked door, Clara stirred in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. Mr. Harrow stood frozen, trapped between guilt and grief, between love and fear. "I never meant for you to be dragged into this," he said quietly. "But now that you are, you deserve to know." He turned to me fully then. "And you deserve the choice I never gave anyone else." The fog outside thickened, pressing against the glass. I realized then that stepping into that house had never been an accident. That something, fate, grief, or something far darker had drawn me there. And as I stood in that dim hallway, surrounded by secrets long buried, I understood one terrifying truth. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. I sank down onto the narrow wooden bench beneath the window, my legs finally betraying me. My knees trembled so violently I was afraid they might give out entirely, and for a moment I simply sat there, staring out at the fog, trying to steady my breathing. Outside, the mist had grown so thick it swallowed everything beyond the glass. The garden, the fence, even the old oak tree at the edge of the property had vanished, as though the world itself had been erased. It felt fitting somehow. My life before this moment, before this truth, had disappeared just as completely. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" I whispered, my voice barely strong enough to leave my throat. "Why didn't you tell me?" He lowered himself onto the bench beside me, careful, almost painfully so, to leave a small gap between us. It was a gesture that spoke louder than words, an unspoken acknowledgement of how fragile everything was between us now. He stared at his hands for a long time before answering, as if the truth was something sharp he might cut himself on if he wasn't careful. "Your father sold you to me because he believed I was wealthy enough to save your family," he said at last, bitterness lacing every word. "He didn't care about truth, only survival. And I didn't tell you because I didn't want to frighten you away. You were young. You deserved a life untouched by this." He lifted his gaze briefly toward the locked door down the hall, then looked away again. "But this house doesn't allow for innocence." His voice cracked on the last word, splitting open like old wood under too much strain. For the first time since I had crossed that threshold as his bride, I saw him clearly, not as the feared man whispered about in the town, not as the distant husband I barely knew, not even as the mystery cloaked in shadows, but as someone drowning slowly in sorrow. A man who had been handed grief too large for one soul and left alone to carry it until it hollowed him out. "The crying you heard," he continued quietly, "comes on nights when she wakes disoriented. When she doesn't know where she is or how much time has passed. The scratching," he swallowed hard. "She scratches at the walls when she believes she can find the baby again." His eyes glistened despite his effort to keep his voice steady. "She believes our daughter is still alive somewhere in these walls." A cold shiver slid down my spine, settling deep in my bones. Suddenly the house felt different. Not haunted by spirits or curses as the town liked to imagine, but by grief so thick it had soaked into the wood, into the floors and beams and bricks, until the house itself seemed to breathe sorrow. "Lillian," he said softly, turning toward me at last, "I never meant to bring you into this burden." I didn't know what to say. My entire future had been traded without my consent, my girlhood exchanged like a sack of grain, and yet, looking at this broken man beside me, something inside my chest shifted. It wasn't acceptance. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was understanding. And understanding, I would later learn, can be just as dangerous and just as powerful as love. As the fog pressed harder against the windows, smothering the light, he covered his face with his hands and whispered, "I don't know how to save her anymore." For the first time since my wedding day, the truth settled into my heart with an ache so deep I could barely breathe. I had not married a monster. I had married a man living with one. In the weeks that followed his confession, the house felt different. Not lighter. Not safer. But more honest. As though the truth, once spoken aloud, had cracked open some hidden window deep within its walls, allowing fresh air to seep into places long sealed shut. I moved through each day with deliberate care, learning the rhythms of the house the way one learns the moods of a wounded animal, slowly, patiently, respectfully. I learned which floorboards creaked and which stayed silent, which doors needed a gentle hand, and which windows rattled when the wind changed direction. I learned the fragile silences, the kind that could soothe or shatter depending on how they were handled. Clara had calm days and terrible ones. On the calm days, the house seemed to exhale as though relieved by her peace. On the terrible days, every sound felt amplified: the scrape of her nails, the sudden cries, the long restless pacing behind the locked door. On those days I would sit outside her room, my back against the wall, and hum softly. Old lullabies my mother once sang. Songs without words. I wanted her to know she wasn't alone, even if she couldn't see me. I was no doctor, no healer. But I understood what it meant to feel forgotten, to feel unseen, to feel as though the world had moved on without you. And slowly, very slowly, she began to respond. Sometimes she would hum the last note after I finished. Sometimes she whispered things that made no sense, fragments of memory tangled together. But she whispered them to me. Mr. Harrow watched these small shifts with a hope so fragile it looked almost painful in his eyes. He never interfered, never rushed, never asked more than what came naturally. Over time we found a rhythm, not a traditional marriage, not anything close to what I had imagined as a girl, but a partnership built out of necessity, honesty, and shared survival. We spoke more. Not about love or romance, but about practical things. About the estate. About finances. About how to keep the house standing when it felt like everything else was crumbling. I learned the books of his estate, learned how to read ledgers thick with dust and neglect. I learned how to manage orders, how to negotiate with merchants who looked at me with thinly veiled amusement, assuming a young woman couldn't possibly understand numbers. Oh, how surprised they were when I did. I took in mending, small repairs at first, hemming skirts, fixing torn sleeves. Then larger tasks. Eventually, I began repairing and altering gowns for ladies in town, those same women who had whispered about me behind gloved hands on my wedding day. They came at first with cautious curiosity, their eyes darting around the house as though expecting something terrible to leap out at them. But when they saw my stitches, fine, steady, precise, they returned. Word spread. Money trickled in. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just a girl sold into marriage. I was a woman building something of her own. The town's view of us changed slowly. Rumors softened not because people apologize, but because they grow bored. As they saw the garden being tended again, saw flowers blooming where weeds once choked the soil, saw me walking into town with my head held a little higher, the whispers faded. The house no longer loomed like a beast in the fog. It began to look lived in, cared for. They didn't know Clara still slept behind a locked door. They didn't need to. They only needed to see that something had shifted. Over time, Mr. Harrow and I grew into a quiet companionship. He never pushed, never demanded, never sought more than I was willing to give. In that gentle restraint, I found a strange sense of safety. I had been sold, but I had not been claimed. I had been traded, but I had not been used. In a world where women often had no choices, that alone was its own kind of mercy. Years passed. The business grew. I trained young girls from town to sew and mend, giving them skills their families couldn't afford to teach. Some came from hardship like I had. Others simply wanted a place to feel useful. The house, once so heavy with sorrow, filled with soft chatter, the rhythmic hum of sewing machines, the scent of tea and lavender. Even Clara, on her clearest days, would sit by the door of her room and listen. Sometimes a faint smile would cross her lips, as if the sound of women's voices awakened a distant, happier memory she couldn't quite reach. Time carried us all forward. Mr. Harrow grew frail, his steps slower, his hair thinning, his grief gentler but never gone. Clara grew quieter, drifting more than fighting now. And I grew stronger in ways I never imagined the frightened girl on her wedding night could ever become. I built a life from the ruins I'd been handed. Not perfect. Not simple. Not the story a young girl dreams of. But real. Honest. And mine. Now, as an old woman with silver hair and hands lined by years of work, I look back not with bitterness, but with gratitude for the strange, winding road that shaped me. My name is Lillian, though you can still call me Lily, sweetheart, and I want you to remember this. Life will hand you storms you never asked for. But you can still decide who you become after the rain. Thank you for sitting with me a while. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. This old grandma still has many more stories to tell, and I'd love for you to be here when I do.